the fact that we did get the defense authorization bill out of the House and Senate, and the president should sign it this week, that does have funding both for Ukraine. There's ways to continue to support Israel. It also does have funding for Taiwan and a pretty large amount in there to help make sure our friends in Taiwan can continue to defend themselves. That said, we don't have a lot of time, and I hope one of the first things that we do when we get back in January is take up the supplemental bill with Ukraine funding, with Israel funding, with humanitarian aid, with Indo-Pacific funding, and with border security, and get that done. So I'm confident the folks in the Senate are going to continue working through the holiday. We're ready to weigh in on the House side as we need to, and then hopefully as soon as we get back, we have that ready to vote.
Spending time with Congressman Ami Bera here on Bloomberg Sound On. I have to ask you about the hot war underway between Israel and Hamas at the same time, realizing this is less of a money issue or a funding issue, and it's become a very divisive political issue for Democrats, for this administration supporting Israel, and what some see as a disproportionate response to what happened on October 7th. We talked about this a couple of months ago, Congressman, and I wonder where you are now. We have a new poll out today from the New York Times and Siena, and it's showing problems consistent with other polls for Joe Biden, particularly among young people. 18 to 29-year-olds disapprove the way that the president is handling this conflict. Where are you right now?
Yeah, so obviously the acts that took place on October 7th were heinous, and what Hamas did, Israel will prosecute a war against Hamas. But all the video imagery of innocent civilian lives, the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding in Gaza, is also taking a toll. And I think a lot of young people are seeing these images on TikTok, on Instagram, et cetera, and it is making them question what we're doing in Israel. That said, it is really complicated. We'll stand by our allies in Israel, but as friends sometimes have to do. And I think you're seeing the president, Jake Sullivan, and others really messaging to the Israelis that it's time to start wrapping up this phase of the war. They'll continue to prosecute a campaign against Hamas, but let's do it in a more precise way using special operators, et cetera. And let's shift now to saving innocent kids, innocent older folks. There's a humanitarian crisis unfolding, lack of food, lack of clean water. My staff was talking to Doctors Without Borders. They don't have antibiotics, and so many people are dying just of secondary infections. And that's not war. That's entirely preventable. Let's save those lives.
There's an important headline I was just reading on the terminal here. The president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, telling ambassadors from around the world that they are prepared to agree to a second pause, a second truce, if it means the return of more hostages held by Hamas. Is that a realistic overture at this point? I know the CIA director is back abroad. He's in Warsaw right now working on a potential truce. Will that happen potentially over the holiday here?
I certainly hope so. I mean, that would be important to get the hostages back. And then as part of that truce, to get needed food, antibiotics, medications, fuel to run the remaining hospitals that, I don't think there's that much left. Clean water. I mean, these are, folks are going to die of starvation, die of diarrhea, et cetera. And those are lives that we can save. And I say that as a doctor. Again, Israel will prosecute this war, but if we can get a humanitarian pause, if we can get some of the hostages back, and if we can save some of these lives, that would be great.
You are a doctor, a former practicing physician, the former chief medical officer for Sacramento County, Congressman. When the gates finally open again and humanitarian aid can move into Gaza, what is it they will need most?
They will need clean water immediately. 96% of the water in Gaza, as I'm told, is undrinkable. And just the amount of folks that are getting cholera, getting treatable infectious diseases, and then starvation. I mean, you're hearing really bad reports that they're running out of food in Gaza. And again, the aid trucks are there. We just have to get more crossings open, get that aid in there, make sure it's getting to the civilians and getting to the right folks. And again, I think everyone's ready to step up. We introduced a resolution last week to really encourage the president to continue to push for that humanitarian aid.
Mm-hmm. In the meantime, we've got a very serious situation in the Red Sea. As we hear the defense secretary announcing this new maritime task force to protect commercial vessels, many of which have stopped traveling through the Red Sea due to these persistent attacks from Houthi militants in Yemen. To what extent will this task force make a difference, Congressman? Is this something your committee is focused on?
It is. And again, I think the president very early in this conflict was decisive, moving assets into the region, aircraft carriers and other support assets to make sure this conflict didn't broaden. We've talked to our friends, the Saudi foreign ministers in Washington, D.C. last week, as well as the foreign ministers from Qatar and Jordan and Turkey, meeting with Secretary Blinken, but also met with us on the House. And, along with trying to figure out how to end the conflict in Gaza and the day after, we did discuss how to continue to keep these maritime straits that are super important in terms of commerce open, how to make sure, we kept the Houthi rebels out of this. And it is something that we're actively thinking about.
Is the U.S. going to strike targets in Yemen, go to the source to stop this from happening?
Again, that might be one way to stop it. Right now, I think, we're protecting the ships and doing what we have to do. But if this escalates, I can certainly see a scenario where we have to go to the source and address that at the root cause. It's
pretty important. I wonder, as you talk to Democrats in the House, to Democrats even more so in California, and as I mentioned, younger Democrats, as we've seen, 18 to 30, 18 to 34, depending on the poll, who say we need to stop funding this action by Israel. Is there a line that Bibi Netanyahu could potentially cross that would cause that to happen?
I'm not a Netanyahu supporter, and I think he's made some real grave errors that have led us to where we are today. When I talk to some of my Palestinian American constituents who have lost relatives, friends, and it's heart-wrenching as well, just as when I talk to some of my Israeli constituents and Jewish American constituents. Mm-hmm. How I approach it is that the Israelis need to do everything that they can to minimize innocent civilian lives. And I think it's a reasonable question to ask how they're prosecuting this war. And see if they can do it in a more precise way. War is horrible, and we're seeing the horrors of war. The other thing that I say to young people is the one thing we can do is make sure innocent civilians don't die of starvation, of lack of clean water, lack of access to medications. That's not war. That's compassion and humanitarian aid. And that's something that I really do push the Israelis to allow more crossings to open and to get that aid in there to prevent people from dying from eminently preventable causes.